Good morning. I like the response. Good energy. My name's Abe Canoff, for those of you who don't know me, the Executive Symposium editor of the Emory International Law Review. I guess at this point, I know it's a technology-related conference, so I won't ask you to turn off your cell phones, but if you haven't done so already, maybe silence them, at least for the time being. That would be greatly appreciated. Also, before we begin, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't thank a handful of people without whom this event quite literally would not have been possible. I'd like to thank the Center for International and Comparative Law, specifically Professor An-Naim for his generosity, and Edie Bridges for her incredible hard work throughout the past few months. We need to thank Eric Blackwell and Amy Tozer for their patience and their expertise, Corky Gallo and Scott Andrews for filming today's event, so that those who couldn't make it can watch online, and so that all of you can rewatch again and again and again in the coming weeks. I'd like to thank Dan Englander and Rachel Kaufman for their friendship, Dean Shapiro, and all of our speakers and moderators for their interest and participation in our symposium and a belief in what we're doing and trying to promote here, the members of the Emory International Law Review for all their help in running the show, and finally I'd like to thank all of you, some who've traveled really from far and wide to be here. I'm really happy to see you all, and it's greatly appreciated. Claude Shannon, an artificial intelligence pioneer, met his wife, Mary Elizabeth, at work. This was Bell Labs in Murray Hill, New Jersey, the early 1940s. He was an engineer working on wartime cryptography and signal transmission. She was a computer. If this sounds odd to us in any way, it's worth knowing that nothing at all seemed odd about it to them, nor to their coworkers. To their Bell Labs colleagues, their romance was a perfectly normal one, typical even. Engineers and computers wooed all the time. In the early 20th century, before a computer was one of the digital processing devices that so proliferate our 21st century lives, in our offices, in our homes, in our cars, and increasingly in our pockets, it was something else, a job description. From the mid-18th century onward, computers, who were frequently women, were on the payrolls of corporations, engineering firms, and universities, performing calculations and doing numerical analysis, sometimes with the use of a rudimentary calculator. These original human computers were behind the calculations for everything from the first accurate predictions of the return of Halley's Comet to the Manhattan Project. In the 1950s, early computer scientists described the unheard of digital computer by making analogies to a human computer. Fast forward to today. Of course, it is now the digital computer that is not only the default term, but also the literal one. And it is the human computer that is relegated to the illegitimacy of the figurative. Digital computers have moved light years beyond the capabilities of those early glorified calculators. But even more significantly, we have moved light years beyond the computer's hardware. Whether you call it the internet, the cloud, cyberspace, or the interwebs, it's all out there, for better or worse. Through today's symposium, we aim to address some of the legal issues, policies, and implications that have arisen or are likely to arise in the future from the internet and the ever-expanding role it plays in our world. In just a few minutes, we'll hear from our first panel, how internet access and social media have changed revolutionary tactics and government response. Their discussion will be followed by a question and answer session, during which we ask those of you with questions to kindly use the microphones placed in the aisles. We'll break for lunch around 11:15, then reconvene at 12:30 to hear from Eric Greenwald, Senior Advisor to the Director of Operations at U.S. Cyber Command. We'll take a brief break after Mr. Greenwald's presentation to stretch our legs and grab refreshments, and we'll close with our second panel, Reconceptualizing International Law Frameworks in Response to the Threat of Cyber Warfare, which will begin at 1:45. But first, we are honored to have a few words from one of the best professors that I've ever had, both a gentleman and a scholar, our interim dean, Robert Shapiro.
Well, thanks very much, and thanks to all of you for being here. I'd like to thank in particular Dan Englander, the editor-in-chief of the Emory International Law Review, Abe Canoff, the executive symposium editor, as well as Professor Laurie Blank and all the other students, staff, and faculty who have worked so hard at putting together this impressive event. Special thanks to our co-sponsors, the Center for International and Comparative Law, and the American Society of International Law's Liber Society on the Law of Armed Conflict. At Emory Law, we pride ourselves on our dynamic intellectual community that unites our students, faculty, and alumni. Student journals, such as the Emory International Law Review, are central to that community. They play a very important role in the intellectual life of our law school. In addition, the Emory International Law Review is central to our larger commitment to international law. The review is part of a constellation that also shines through our superb international law faculty, the Center for International Comparative Law, the International Humanitarian Law Clinic, and all of our other international programs. In all of its programs, Emory Law promotes a world in which law provides a common framework for engaging our most complex social and economic challenges and achieving positive social transformation. The topic of today's symposium, International Law and the Internet, is exactly the kind of complex challenge that we aim to address. Every social and technological development reshapes the boundaries of the law and drives the law in new directions. Industrialization brought novel understandings of tort law and workers' compensation. The automobile created the possibility of causing harm far from home, posing unprecedented challenges in the area of personal jurisdiction. Right? So much for the world of Pennoyer versus Neff. So too, the internet has reshaped contemporary society in countless ways, and again, altered legal categories, both domestic and international. In 1981, it was bomb strikes on nuclear facilities that presented questions of international order and self-defense. In 2010, it was cyber attacks that provided some of the most potent instruments of fighting cross-border wars against nuclear proliferation. As always, the new technology can be liberating or oppressive. It can foster positive global transformation or enable new forms of surveillance and control. Twitter and Facebook are credited with facilitating democratic mobilization across the Middle East. However, while social media can be a tool for harnessing international attention and for organizing protests, they can also be a tool for oppressive regimes to root out and track down dissidents. The internet knows no geographical boundaries, but may be subject to varying regimes of censorship in each nation that it touches. The internet can be an instrument for promoting human rights around the world or for infringing them. What role will there be for domestic and international law in enhancing the positive impact of the internet and limiting the harm? The subject could not be more pressing and significant. An indicator of the importance of today's topic is the prominence it enjoyed at another similar gathering, the World Economic Forum, which also brought together celebrities from the realms of government, business, and entertainment in Davos, Switzerland last week. As one participant in that forum noted, and I quote, "5 years ago, Davos was discussing new business models. Now that has totally dropped. Now it is all about the internet. They used to have answers here, and now it seems people are comfortable with questions. The internet has a lot of questions." Well, as at Davos, I'm sure today's outstanding panelists will raise many questions. Given their superb qualifications, I'm confident that not only will they have questions, they may even provide some answers to those questions. Well, we're all looking forward to it, and thank you again for your participation, and we look forward to enjoying our day together. Thank you.
At this point, I'd like to call the members of our first panel, Ramnath Chalapa, Sasha Meinrath, and Ryan Budish. Thanks, guys.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first panel on Internet access and social media. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm local, just across the street in the business school. I'm Ram Chelap. I'm a faculty in the business school there. And so we have with us two very interesting panelists who have a long history of working sort of in this area. We have with us Ryan Budish from Howard University, the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And we also have with us Sasha Mainrath, New America Foundation Open Technology Initiative. So the main idea behind the panel today, and we were sort of was talking with the two other panelists, we will start with briefly introducing ourselves and sort of talk about some of the work that we do in this area and how it actually relates to sort of the various challenges posed both from a legal and social perspective with regards to the internet and social media. And then we will, perhaps discuss a couple of issues that are at the forefront now pretty much across the globe, and we'll then open it up to questions that you may have for the panelists. So with regards to the sort of the internet and allied technologies, I mean, it's sort of a very, we have some very unique challenges. And so I have been working with the internet and particularly the business elements of the internet since sometime in 1993, back when I was a PhD student at the University of Texas. And what is sort of interesting is that, and this is really what I tell my students as well, is that the internet really was created so a bunch of geeks could share information, that was really why it was created. I mean, it was created purely for sharing information, very academic purposes. And what has really become interesting is that we are imposing all kinds of laws, commercial laws. We're trying to deal with social issues. We're trying to deal with laws that cut across, different parts of the globe, and trying to figure out how we can actually make all this work. And so we have seen some success with sort of at least having the ability to do commerce on the internet, with various laws that have sort of come in. Some of them make sense, some of them don't. And I remember how, we were trying to legislate internet so that it differs from state to state. This was actually a discussion that happened back in 95, 96, and we all know that, how ridiculous that sort of sounds to regulate the internet from state to state. And of course, now we are talking about regulation from country to country. And so we need to sort of think about sort of the basic setup of it, the nature of what we call open standards and so on. And so we will get to some of those fundamental questions as we have a conversation. So let me start with asking Ryan to introduce himself and talk about some of the work he's doing in this realm so that we can get the conversation going. Ryan.
Thank you very much. My name is Ryan Budish, and as was said, I'm a fellow at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. And at the center, I'm director of a project called HERDICT, which is a crowdsourced project for identifying internet censorship and other web blockages. People often wonder about the name, and so I like to begin by explaining, because if I don't, sometimes people mishear it, and then they end up with some awkward questions later. So the name comes from, it's a portmanteau of verdict of the herd, because we're crowdsourced. So to give you an analogy to explain what we do, if the power goes out in your home or dorm or apartment, the first thing you might do is look out your window or look down your hall to see if you're the only person, if it's just you. We do the same thing for the web. If you can't access Facebook or the BBC's site, you can go to HERDICT, you can file a report, and you can see whether other people are having the same problem. Users report to us data through our website, herdict.org, through Twitter, through email. We have a toolbar that they can install into their browser. And we collect all of these reports. While one report doesn't tell us very much, getting 5 or 10 or 100 reports allows us to start drawing interesting conclusions about what's going on around the world in real time. Because we rely on user-generated data, we have the same problem as many activist organizations. How do we find and retain participants? And so I want to take a few minutes to talk about that from the perspective of what we do. One possible model is online activism. The internet is a tremendous medium for reaching many people. But the problem is that online activism often stops at clicking the like button on Facebook. On the other extreme, another model is traditional in-person forms of activism. These can be highly effective, but they often involve more extreme, smaller, insular communities of activists. This kind of atmosphere can frequently be off-putting to more mainstream folks, even though they're sympathetic to the cause that's being advocated. So to begin, I'd sort of like to discuss the good and the bad of internet activism versus traditional activism. If we start with traditional activism, from the freedom rides of 1964 to Amnesty International to Human Rights Watch, there's no question that these groups have had a tremendous impact on millions of people's lives. There's just no question about that. And moreover, the participants have often done this at grave danger, grave risk to their own bodies. For example, in 1964, when people went down to Mississippi to register blacks to vote, 4 volunteers were killed, 80 were beaten, and these were people who were just giving freely their time. So tremendous commitment. But that form of activism, traditional activism, poses several problems if you're trying to build a really broad-based movement. The most challenging one, I think, is that traditional activism has a tendency to produce insular communities that are intimidating to those on the outside and even sometimes to those on the inside. Michael Albert, who's an economist and a founder of a radical left-wing media group, he was talking about his experiences, and he called this the stickiness problem. By that, he meant that members often find themselves criticized by other members in the group who question their loyalty and their motives, and he ultimately expressed the fear that, and this is a quote from him, "We will be running in ever-narrowing circles with a movement of diehards rather than astute social critics." So traditional activism has problems if you're trying to build a really broad-based community. But online activism doesn't necessarily fare much better typically. Before getting to the challenges, though, it's worth considering the promise that the internet holds. The internet is ideally suited for coordinating and organizing global protest and activism. For example, when one Chinese dissident was recently about to be arrested, he tweeted out that to his followers, and they were immediately able to raise awareness about this and eventually get him released. Another example was just this past summer. There was, many of you may be familiar, there was a high-speed train crash in Wenzhou in China, which killed 40 people and injured 191. Just a couple of years ago, news about a disaster like this would have been given small mention in the state media and would have quickly been forgotten. This summer, however, Chinese citizens took to the Chinese microblogging site, which is very similar to Twitter. They took to it in droves, and they discussed the accident and expressed their dissatisfaction with the way it was handled, and actually ended up putting an enormous amount of pressure on both the local and national governments. So the internet holds great promise for human rights activism, and it has even been called as much of a social revolution as a technical one. But in reality, in a lot of cases, online activism has been pretty disappointing. Because it's driven down the cost of participation so low, it is really easy to get 1 million people to send an email or to click like on Facebook. But then the next thing that usually happens is they pat themselves on the back and then they go back to watching videos of kittens playing piano on YouTube. For this reason, online activism is often criticized as armchair activism, or my favorite term, slacktivism. And so online organizations can often boast millions of members, but in most cases, simply signing a single petition or joining a single mailing list is sufficient to make one a member. This means that it's a lot harder as an organization to rely on those members and retain them. And I don't want to give the impression that this is a new problem or this is the internet's fault. Direct mail campaigns suffer many of the same problems. Greenpeace, for example, using direct mail, tripled its membership between 1985 and 1990, and then proceeded to lose 85% of its membership over the next 8 years. So, on the one hand, we have traditional human rights activism, which can sustain higher risk, more involved activities, but it often deters everyone but the most hardcore participants. On the other hand, we have online activism, which can include millions of people, yet which fails to really build a meaningful relationship between the members and the cause. At Herdict, we're really trying to achieve a blend of the best of both worlds. We're trying to merge the willingness to take on a little bit of risk, do something that's slightly more risky than just clicking like on Facebook, but has more of the broad-based support found in online activism. In many parts of the world, supporting internet freedom can be risky. Just like signing a petition during the McCarthy era might have gotten you on a blacklist, speaking out against censorship in China or Iran can be very high risk. In fact, Chinese prosecutors just the other day, I believe, they prosecuted a 58-year-old poet in China on the basis of an allegedly incendiary poem and some Skype conversations that he had. If they succeed in convicting him, which it seems likely from what I've read that they will, he could face 9 or more years in prison for a poet. If supporting internet freedom is risky, then we have a problem in how can we convince people in China and other countries to participate in Herdict. Sociologists have studied what motivates someone to participate in riskier forms of activism, and they've concluded that there are 2 factors. The participant must view participation as consistent with their perception of their own identity, and that view must be reinforced by influential, organizational, and personal connections that that person has. And we were cognizant of this when we were creating Herdict, and we've tried to structure it in a way that would take advantage of those factors. First, we are trying to reduce the risk of participation. Second, we are tapping into a less controversial identity. And third, we're working to build stronger community ties within the site. As a crowdsourced project, we can really reduce the risk to participants in ways that traditional activism is simply unable to do. Participation in the traditional sense tends to be more binary. You either attended the protest or you didn't. You either wrote the anti-censorship blog or you didn't. And talking about writing 1/1000th of a blog post doesn't make any sense. In contrast, that's essentially what we're able to do with Herdict. Participants are provided some degree of protection because their contribution of reporting a single site that they can or cannot access is an incredibly small action. While this doesn't completely insulate them, there's no denying that if a single Chinese citizen, for instance, wrote up a list of all blocked sites, that person would be in much graver danger than a citizen who simply clicked a button that said that they can't access their favorite blog. Second, because people participate in riskier forms of activism only when they view it as consistent with their identity, we've taken the very conscious decision, we've made the conscious decision to de-emphasize human rights in favor of more common, less controversial conceptions of identity. One could imagine that on our site we could declare very loudly that internet access is a human right and issue a strong call to action to defend that right. But we don't do this. Why not? Well, for 2 reasons. First, if we plastered internet is a human right all over our website, the Great Firewall of China and other filtering systems would probably immediately block us. Second, making our project about human rights activism would complicate things for many of our potential participants that we're seeking to get involved. For instance, it could trigger less than positive associations with other human rights organizations whose extreme members, positions, or actions may have alienated the person that we're trying to reach. Alternatively, our potential member may simply not view herself as an activist or have no desire to view herself in that light. And additionally, the participant might get caught up over whether they agree in the first place whether internet access is a human right or not. So we're unlikely to build the kind of broad-based membership that we want by focusing on human rights. In contrast, there are other more common and less controversial identities that we can use to motivate participation. For instance, one does not need to view themselves as a human rights activist in order to believe that they should be able to access Wikipedia for schoolwork, communicate with friends on Facebook, or engage in e-commerce. Such beliefs can be tied to people's conceptions of themselves as academics, friends, or entrepreneurs. So allowing participants to report on the sites that they care about, we can encourage participation based upon self-identification that's already meaningful to them. And the last way that we're trying to bridge the gap between traditional activism and online activism is by adding more social encouragement. As we're still very much a young project at the Berkman Center, so this piece is still more a work in progress, but we're looking to take two discrete tacks. First, we're trying to use participants' existing organizational affiliations. So to do that, we're trying to create something called branded cues. These would allow organizations to identify sets of sites that they're interested in. For instance, Amnesty International might want to know both whether its own sites are blocked and maybe whether censorship circumvention sites are blocked. So Amnesty could add these lists to a queue, and the organization would then be able to encourage its members to report on those sites. People who associate themselves with Amnesty and for whom that's an important part of their identity would be more willing to participate if they believe they're helping that cause. The second form of social encouragement we're trying to build into HERDICT is to build a community within the site itself. Currently, there's no way for our users to communicate with each other. If I'm interested in knowing what's going on with Facebook in Russia, I have to wait until someone in Russia reports on the site. But we're working right now to make it so that I could put out an APB of sorts and specifically request assistance from our Russian users to test that site. So I want to conclude just by saying that I'm not trying to suggest that one form of activism is better than another. There's certainly a role for Facebook groups with the millions and millions of users that they have. And traditional activism can certainly accomplish things that cannot be achieved otherwise. But I do believe that the internet, with its enormous potential, can really be used more effectively to bring together a broader coalition of participants to participate in slightly more risky and involved forms of activism, and then ultimately achieve the change that they're trying to get.
Thank you, Ryan. And that was an interesting perspective on online versus offline activism. And of course, we have seen with the Spring Revolution and the whole Twitter activity that sort of preceded it as supposedly even the cause of being able to even organize. So we'll actually come back to discussing some of those elements as to what extent these things are controlled and what might be some issues that come around it. But first, let's hear from Sasha Mainrath on some of the work that they do at the New America Foundation.
Sure. Thank you. Let me start by saying I had a presentation I was going to give, and then I had a great dinner conversation last night. So I dumped that, started over, and so now you're the guinea pigs on a slightly tweaked version of what I was going to talk about. And let me also start with this disclaimer. I'm going to talk about forces of good and evil, and the battle that's at play here in the United States and is playing out in Washington, D.C. today. I can do this because I'm in an independent think tank, which means I don't have any gag orders or rules about what I can and cannot talk about. But I want to be clear, I'm not talking about the folks that I was having dinner with last night, who I view as some of the good guys working inside the Beltway to help fix what is clearly a broken system when it comes to foreign policy, internet activism, and technological reality. And at the heart of this, I view internet access as something akin to sort of education or like literacy writ large. Its impacts are overwhelmingly positive, not solely, but overwhelmingly positive. They're liberatory, they're empowering, and they're disconcertingly unpredictable. If you're the guy that's trying to oppress or control or dominate somebody else. In my work, that of the team that I oversee, the allied organizations we work with, and kind of the larger hacker community that we intersect with, is very much to accelerate the rollout, the deployment of internet access and communications technologies. But it's not only about this access. It's also about the power to build localized services and applications so that constituencies can use these systems, these technologies, to communicate, share information and resources, in essence, empower themselves to resist, overthrow the bondages of tyranny. And a lot has been said over the years, and especially of lately, around kind of the Facebook or Twitter revolutions. I don't buy that at all. I think that, no one who knows these revolutions and has been talking with folks on the ground would categorize them thusly. They are born of popular unrest. They're mediated almost entirely through pre-existing, mostly offline social networks. And the internet and social media in particular are really simply the lens through which we, as outsiders, have experienced these upheavals. And because that's the lens that we have seen these things through, we ascribe to them an import that those on the ground and actually participating in them do not feel and have not seen. But what if these computer-mediated communications, the Twitters and the Facebooks, are actually acting as an accelerant, not a causal relationship, but an accelerant, a force multiplier, as it were? So if that's the case, and I also believe that that is, then how we support and replicate and improve upon these existing platforms is actually reflective of our biases and our priorities for nothing less than the future of participatory democracy. And so one of the keys, I believe, to today's 21st century statescraft, as it's called, is understanding how and why these technologies and the community empowerment that they make possible align, and why they align often, maybe not always, but often with U.S. foreign policy priorities. So Hillary Clinton's agenda, rather than being viewed as sort of this radical departure from sort of traditional realpolitik, is actually more embracing of today's technological reality. And within this context, the work that I do, the work that the Open Technology Initiative and its allies, rather than being viewed as sort of this heretical machination of the so-called evil hacker community, is actually embraced actively by the State Department as sort of the epitome of this self-organized, pro-democracy, anti-oppression, human rights agenda. And that is, without a doubt, a sea change in how foreign policy thinking is happening right now. And it is, make no mistake, often hated by those that are holding on to a more antiquated, Cold Warrior mentality about force projection and control and surveillance. So over the past few years, I've had the privilege and opportunity to talk pretty extensively with a lot of the brains, the people behind this 21st century statecraft. And I'll say that they are fighting an uphill battle, without a doubt, to align U.S. foreign policy work with kind of a forward-thinking, human rights-based agenda. And OTI's Commotion project, the Internet in a Suitcase that we oversee, is part of this new thinking. It's a small part, but it is an important part of this new thinking, because it provides resources for people to communicate in places where that would otherwise not be possible. And the outcomes from those communications, that organizing, that information sharing, is often, though again not always, an accelerant then of democratic rights-based society. And if these internet freedom fighters on the one hand are the rebels, then the empire on the other is epitomized by kind of the Cold Warriors who are fighting to lock down, surveil, and monitor the communications over these self-same networks. And today, right now, the rebels are ascendant. The internet freedom fighters are winning these battles and gaining traction. But like any sequel, the empire will strike back. And we've seen this already. So if you've been following the news, SOPA and PIPA, right, the Stop Online Piracy Act and the Protect IP Act, are kind of the empire's first foray, a vanguard action, testing the defenses of internet freedom. And the import of SOPA and PIPA isn't just the egregiously bad, extra-legal, sensorial purview, which is bad enough, but rather that if they pass, they actually necessitate the creation of the world's most advanced, far-reaching, privacy-invasive, technological panopticon in order to enforce. And the forces behind SOPA and PIPA, from industry lobby groups, which are the core and the catalyst for them, but also the individual politicians, are actively working, some through malfeasance, but most through total ignorance, to undermine the fundamental human right to communicate. That's the impact of these, that's the ramification of these legislations. So this past month, the forces of good, I'm happy to say, prevailed. You know, the rebels, the internet freedom fighters, we scored an important victory, right? SOPA and PIPA went down in twin blazes of glory, and thank goodness for that. But now here's a quick check of the audience's responsiveness. How many of you have ever seen a movie? A lot of you have. Some of you say you haven't, which is fascinating. So how many of you have seen the one where, like, 45 minutes into the movie, the protagonists celebrate the death of, like, the mutant, alien, zombie, werewolf, Voldemort, phantasm thingy? And everyone's like, hey, it's dead. Well, that's where we are today. And the veterans in this space, myself included, are hunkering down because we know, like, actually, it's not dead, and it's going to come back. And this is going to be a far larger, more protracted battle over the future of communications, over what side of the equation wins. And stateside, this means addressing sort of the necessary limitations to copyright enforcement and to law enforcement, the responsibilities of producer of technologies that has what we call dual use, and the ineffectiveness in today's technological reality of a lot of the Cold War tactics that have served us well in prior generations. Internationally, this means that we need to align and support communications writ large, privacy, cryptography, encryption, and we need to also align this with a pro-human rights framework and use that as the lens through which we determine the successes and failings of our policies and actions. And most importantly, this means thinking beyond sort of the cat and mouse games that have epitomized current technological development and surveillance countermeasures. So hopefully I've created more questions in people's minds. I've given sort of a 30,000, maybe 50,000 foot view. And I want to leave lots of room for discussion. But the key here is that my work, the work of the dozens of people that work on the Open Technology Initiative and the hundreds of people that are working on these new technologies as a part of our project, is just a very small piece in a far more intricate puzzle. And many of the brightest minds of our generation are likewise working on solutions to what are remarkably intransigent problems. And my hope in coming here is actually the hope that a few of you are interested in joining this kind of battle and are thinking, like, this sounds really interesting and might be something when I can't find a job doing what I'm actually trained to do, maybe this could be something fun to wade into. And so I'm hoping that some people feel inspired to help solve these problems and want to join on these battles. So thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the conversation that follows. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sasha. And so it seems like there are a lot of incomplete and unsuccessful attempts at legislating the internet. I'm sure the lawyers here are very happy at these arbitrage opportunities that are going to present from these laws. Let me put on my business school hat for a moment. And it seems like, sort of much before the internet was being used for these social revolutions or organizations, it seems like they were being used by consumers before. And some of these questions that we're actually talking about today, many businesses and most of us in the academic realm have actually thought about these from the consumer's perspective. So, for example, is the online consumer fundamentally different from the offline consumer? You know, the purchase behavior of the online consumer, is that going to be very different from sort of how the offline or the physical consumer does things? And so going back to some of the issues about sort of the online activism and the nature of it, is it fundamentally different, or is it really another way, another channel through which whatever was physically existing, is that just being manifested, you know, in the online context? And there are sort of some interesting things to sort of talk about and think about there. And this sort of reminds me of sort of these these laws that periodically try to come into place, essentially because there are a lot of these disconnects, and most of these disconnects really come from the open nature of the internet, and sort of what I talked about at the beginning in terms of the purpose of the internet, why it was really created in the first place. In fact, I almost explain it sometimes as sort of a socialist medium on which we try to put capitalistic rules. I mean, the way the internet worked, or how it started to work, was more like you forward my packet, I forward your packet, you know, in terms of sending an email. Nobody asked you why you sent the email, whether you were allowed to send the email, and basically if somebody refused to sort of forward a packet, some router or some entity in between, one just assumed that router was down. It was technically just not available, and therefore it was not accepting, you know, the forwarding of your packet. That is how it was thought through. And then and what we are facing now is, because given that commercial activity and sort of the social activities have come about, do commercial laws apply? Do international laws apply? How do they actually translate onto this sort of big bad land sort of out there? And one example that I often discuss in my class, as somebody who is consulted for the music industry, which is becoming a non-existent industry, I guess, on the internet. I mean, they just hate the internet at various levels for obvious reasons. And so it's kind of very interesting. So one of the questions that we ask is, so suppose, you know, think of the physical context. Suppose you buy a book, you know, and you have an open courtyard in your house. You take the book, you leave it on a desk on there, and then you forget about that book. And let's say there are people passing by that street, they take the book, they photocopy it, leave the book back in there, and then they go about, you know, their job. And so the question is, are you responsible sort of for leaving the book out there and then other people actually copying it? And some people sort of equated sort of piracy to the sort of the same question, or sharing, you know, from one other perspective. You know, is that really what is going on? I'm just putting something out there. Am I sort of responsible? So the reason we ask these questions is really that many of the laws, you know, do not sometimes translate so easily from sort of the physical realm to the online realm, and I want to point out how sort of the U.S. is in some sense has been in a good place due to the fact that the internet actually originated from here. So in other words, most of the first research and the way the standards and protocols of how the internet actually works, they all came from here. So there was a lot of control. In fact, it was, you know, de facto, the U.S. standards actually got adopted. In fact, there are many Europeans who've complained about 25, 30 years ago that some of the protocols they came up with are much more technically better and so on, and those should have sort of driven the internet. But then the primary users and the majority of the users really were from here. So that was the good thing, and therefore there was a lot of control and understanding over how these things should actually work. The truth of the matter is, majority of the users of the internet, you know, on a country basis are now in China. And therefore, the newer technologies, they are attempting, you know, there is a lot of influence that it wants to wield in terms of, let's say, how this new protocol like sort of IPv6 should actually apply. And so they want, you know, a layer that allows sort of the government to sort of oversee if they want. I mean, it'll make it easier for that great firewall to actually work. So there is a lot of activity going on there because, you know, sort of the power is sort of shifting to a lot of these other countries. And the question is, therefore, how will it come back and apply to the internet and its eventual sort of usage, both in the commercial realm as well as in the sort of the social realm. So in that context, I guess one question I want to start with sort of for the panelists is, so what should we do about these local laws? What do we use? Every country wants to sort of maintain its local laws. You know, they're not going to give it up because there is an internet that is actually out there. So in order for them to sort of execute and their local laws, does that mean they should be able to control the internet, or is there an alternative solution to that? And so the reason we asked this question is, I don't know if you've been following recently, Twitter, which was all, you know, sort of the be-all and end-all for many people, at least the people who are reading newspapers, for the Spring Revolution and how so many things actually happened, although as one panelist pointed out, really, you know, so much didn't happen over there. But Twitter recently said that it will allow for some country-specific censorship. And so the question is, I mean, does that make sense? Is it moving away from this sort of the open internet that they're actually supposed to do, or are they simply following the rules and the laws laid down by sort of each country? And in fact, the reasonings behind those, the reason that Twitter gave was actually kind of interesting, which is that, for example, in France and in Germany, it is illegal to promote any Nazi material, whether it is online or offline. And so Twitter said that was a law that we had to follow, and we could not allow anybody to sort of promote, let's say, Nazi material on Twitter. So I guess let me start with that question for the panel as to how these technologies should react to the existence of these local laws and what they might claim as sensitivities or whatever other euphemisms they might actually use. So, Ryan.
Okay, I'll take the first crack at that. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, Twitter would be accessible in every country in uncensored form, as and that was the position that Twitter took during the Arab Spring. They famously, I think, said, "Let the tweets flow," and the problem is that for countries that did not want an uncensored Twitter, they just blocked all of Twitter. China does this, and in its place, a domestic version called Sina Weibo has become hugely popular in China, and Twitter isn't there at all. And so I think from a legal perspective, I mean, there's simply nothing that Twitter can do. If they want access to these countries, and countries, have the sovereign right to claim that they're going to police their people as they see fit, whether they do it rightly or wrongly, whether it's a human right violation or not, they can certainly assert that right and can block Twitter. And so Twitter is put in this difficult situation. Do we want to participate in a country like China, or do we want to take a principled stand and not be there at all? And I think that the decision that they made is understandable in that context, and particularly because the way they did it has a loophole that's about a mile wide. Let's say that I'm in China and I tweet something that the government does not like. The government can go to Twitter and say, please remove this. But right before they do that, Sasha, who follows me on Twitter and is in the United States, he retweets it. If he retweets it from the United States, that takes it out of the censorship regime. So they'd turn off my tweet, but everyone who follows Sasha would still be able to see the tweet, including people who are in China who are following Sasha. So, it's not, the best situation, but from my perspective, I can see why they did it. And personally, I would rather see Twitter, given the fact that it's an accelerant of social change, as Sasha was saying. I'd rather see it in these countries than not see it at all.
So interesting. I mean, so I guess an ineffective and inefficient response at some level. But if you think about it, I mean, this is sort of the question asked by some of the Google folks who are involved in making these decisions. I mean, Google, who which promotes itself as the do no evil company, although I don't know how much of that is true after they bought DoubleClick and all the advertisers, and the new privacy policy, those things that comes to your email which you never read. I think it's about time to read those things. So their response was, we cannot do XYZ of what is required by, let's say, China, therefore we're just not going to operate there. And of course, the alternative response I've heard to that is this is actually a good thing for local Chinese industry because, when I was recently there, I mean, it's like if you look at sort of the prevalence of Baidu and their own search engine and so on, they've developed into as big or a bigger entity than Google in there, and some people think it's probably a good thing over there. So clearly there are multiple sort of side impacts of these. So Sasha, I mean, do you hold the same view in terms of these responses to local laws and requirements?
Yeah, I mean, I agree exactly with what Ryan said, although I have a very different take in that, the loopholes are just a continuation of a cat and mouse game that is unwinnable. You will always then be fighting the next layer of, well, then China's going to do a thing that's going to make it so that you can't access retweets from a Chinese thing, and then there's going to be a countermeasure to that. It doesn't actually solve the underlying problem. And the underlying problem is really what we're talking about is, what are the normative assumptions about living in a civil society? So it was interesting because Ryan opened up with the Freedom Riders, right? So here you had a bunch of local laws. You had people from out of state going to other states because they said, these local laws are simply wrong. And based upon an ethical and moral code, we've decided that living in a civil society in the United States today means that we have not just the privilege of living in a freer state, but a responsibility to undermine wrongful laws, even though they're local. And now this is playing out in a more global setting. And really, it's a question of morals and ethics and what it means for us to think about whether a law is right or wrong. And fundamentally, I think we have both a privilege living as we do in a relatively free society and a responsibility to think about how can we bring the same rights, how can we bring the same freedoms to a more global audience. And so we can descend into a philosophical debate about what is right and wrong at that point in time. But really, to me, I look at throughout the history of communications, dating all the way back to the church and literacy, there's always been blowback. If you give people literacy, they're going to interpret the Bible, the Quran, etc., for themselves, and we can't have that. And these technologies are just generations upon generations upon generations of forward thinking in terms of far more complicated, far more empowering, far more invasive in our everyday lives. But the battles are the same. We're still fighting battles over, should people be empowered to use these technologies to discover the world for themselves, to experience the world for themselves, to share those stories, narratives, and experiences with other people for themselves? Or should that be mediated through some sort of central clearinghouse or monitoring or surveillance or censorship regime? And I would argue, I think most of us would argue, normatively speaking, we actually want people to be empowered for themselves to make these decisions, because the overall impact of that is positive. The overall impact benefits society as a whole. And in that context, I think we should be thinking about, why is Twitter doing this? How are we equating sort of monetary value? Oh my gosh, if we don't self-censor, then we'll lose market share in China, with a normative responsibility to do what's right.
Interesting. I guess, should laws therefore conform to these larger norms that you're talking about, or should the internet change in response to perhaps some of these laws that are in there? And the reason I ask that is you said very forcefully, you talked about the greater good. And the question that is often asked is, what is the evidence of the greater good? Are there studies, or do we know? And this is, one of the questions that is asked both, when trying to legislate or even for a general purpose. I mean, as academics, we are often interested in understanding, how do we quantify this greater good? What is the social welfare sort of impact of technology? And I can speak at least a little bit to the business consumer level. This is the question that was asked. It's like, for example, when the internet came about, the price search and all those came about, people were like, business is going to lose out because everybody's going to search for prices and everybody has to shut down. But eventually what happened is a lot more consumer welfare actually generated, and there are sort of studies that show and look at it. So from a social perspective, how do we know that there is greater good? I mean, is it, how can we quantify it? How do we think about it?
I think there's an incredible array of metrics that have been made over the years spanning quality of life, economic outcomes. You can go to any one of dozens of sites and pick up pretty extensive longitudinal data sets that document some of the problems. I would actually flip that on its head and say, before people infringe upon my ability to communicate, what's the harm I'm doing when I communicate? But really, I think this comes down to the best laws, the best constitutions, the best societies are evolving, always evolving, right? Our notions of what it means to live in society change and shift based upon, in essence, evolutions of thinking about what does it constitute to live the good life or pursue happiness. I mean, talk about nebulous ideas. And some spaces evolve more quickly to meet the needs of their participants, their residents, their citizenry, and others don't and are stagnant. And I'd say, from that perspective, you can start documenting where there's a desire amongst the governed to change governments and a restriction preventing any sort of evolution of that sort as an indicator that something's gone awry, right? And Arab Spring is sort of like, here's what happens when things go awry, and they build up and then explode.
I think the question of how laws in different countries affect what's going on the internet. I mean it's a complicated question, and it's one that countries are going to continue to pass laws, and different countries are going to reach different conclusions as to what those laws should be. But what's going to happen, and it already happens, is the internet that, the way that I see the internet here in the United States is already and will continue to be different from the way that someone sees it in another country. And this technology is evolving very rapidly. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, now the way that I see a Google search is different from the way that Sasha Aram is going to see a Google search, simply because Google is incorporating my Google Plus personal data into deciding what they're going to show me. In the same way, if you're in France or Germany and you try to, there was a lawsuit about this, to access Nazi paraphernalia on Yahoo Auctions at the time was the company that was sued, they were required under law to not show that material to people in France. And so the way that people in France viewed the Yahoo Auction site was different from the way that people saw it in the United States. So given that this is going to continue to grow faster and faster, and it's going to be impossible, or it's going to be much harder to know, or rather I should say it's just going to be much easier to make an internet very different from people in different countries. Really, I think the best solution is simply to have more transparency about what's going on. In the Twitter context, they're posting the takedown notices to a website called Chilling Effects, where you'll be able to see every time a country has demanded that a tweet be censored. At Herdict, we're trying to track what websites are censored in what countries. And so given the fact that it seems like such a difficult, intractable problem to sort of figure out, should there be some, universal law that, on the internet level, given that that seems so difficult and impossible that would never be achieved, it seems like that the only way to deal with the fact that the internet can be different for people in different countries is to have transparency about, what is going on. And then we can discuss whether, what's going on in Vietnam or China or Thailand is right. And with that knowledge, we can then have a debate about whether things should be different. And so I think transparency is the most important piece.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I guess probably one would have to think about using technology at some level to perhaps even manage these legal frameworks. I mean, if you think about it, there can only be one IP address at a time on the internet, right? So that is something that they have. There can only be domain names that are registered in one particular place. So through some sort of a cooperative mechanism, they've come up with some understanding for how this thing should be, functioning. Perhaps there are legal frameworks, and sort of the international code that rules on who can own a domain name and so on. Some of those are perhaps initial artifacts in this particular process. But I think I also would like to underscore sort of the point that, this is all very temporal. I mean, imagine a panel like this, a conversation, like this in, perhaps obviously without the mic and everything in 1st century AD, or during the heydays of the Roman Empire or the Greek Empire. They could not have imagined that there is such a country called the US and which will do X, Y, Z, and whatever norms that they see at that time would be the perfect norms, and they would think that this is how life is to be lived. And so this temporal nature is something, and laws cannot change at that rapid pace as some of these opinions change, and I think that probably creates another level of sort of complexity. And I think that is really where some understanding of the difference between sort of the de jure and the de facto sort of come into play. So for example, in the US, when you think about movie ratings, there is no special censor board, but movies, that is government dictated, but rather the folks in the industry have decided we will subscribe to some sort of an MPAA rating, which is really more an organization-run thing. But for example, like in countries like in India, the government appoints a censor board to provide, particular certificates to movie, whether this is an adult or a children or et cetera, et cetera. So now, and there are obviously historical reasons for why these different things happen. And so that sort of leads me sort of to the next point, that is it really all about government and legislation, or through best practices can firms actually begin to influence and dictate the emergence of sort of good legislation and good way in which they work? And what comes to mind is perhaps one of the things that I'm sort of struggling with in terms of trying to understand, which is sort of this notion of data ownership. How long will Google own this information that one day you search for, a particular book online? How long should they own that information? I mean, there's not really much clarity on some of these things, and there is sort of discussion now in terms of quote-unquote expiration of data, because this has a significant impact on privacy, because the impact on privacy is really from the cumulative information. I mean, it is exponentially much more severe than sort of individual pieces of information. And so there is some belief there that maybe firms through best practices will come up with norms that will get sort of absorbed into sort of different countries. So what do you think? Do you believe that the firms have a role perhaps at times superseding what the government might think about it? Sasha?
Well, I mean, we have 150 years of telecommunications history that says that these sorts of voluntary commitments never worked, right? I mean, the United States has literally gone to war based on false information propagated over our telegraph system, and it's constantly being manipulated. The question of privacy is a huge one in today's day and age. It's one that our laws are mostly mute on. It's one that is. It absolutely pits the Fourth Amendment rights of all of us against the constructed rights of corporations. And, I think you can tell exactly where I come down on this. I think it's crazy that we don't have parameters that lay out what is acceptable behavior for corporations. I think I think the failure of leadership in this space and the kicking of creating voluntary standards for to corporations, right, to self-govern and what have you, stands in direct contrast to a century and a half of precedent. And it boggles my mind, in fact, that the FTC, the DOJ, the FCC have failed to take account of that massive history in this space. I'd also add, your parallels between sort of empire, right, of, whether you're talking about first century or maybe third, fourth century AD, and sort of the MPAA, RIAAs of the world. I think there is actually a parallel to be made, which is, late stage empire always overprojects its power. It's sort of an indicator of like, yeah, they're going down. And when I look at Nutella, Napster, Mega Upload more recently, when I look at SOPA and PIPA and ACTA and all of these other legislative attempts to somehow project the power of the copyright industry into spaces that they simply shouldn't be, and into battles they simply cannot win, it does remind me of the Romans, right? I mean, it is egregiously bad policy to do what they're doing, and it has done nothing except accelerate the development of technologies that make piracy more normative, easier to do, more widespread. And yet they continue to do it. I mean, we just had Mega Upload rated, a few weeks ago. It's amazing to me.
I mean, so the economic rationale behind intellectual property right laws was that it will foster innovation, and so how do we
support science and the useful arts?
Right, and so how do we trade that off against, not letting corporations figure things out for themselves, and legislative ability being absolutely poor in terms of coming up with laws. So are we just in the flux, in an intermediate stage, and things will get figured out, or what might be sort of appropriate actions and thinking? And the reason I ask that is, for example, you have this very interesting project of the internet in a suitcase, which is basically, I guess if I paraphrase, just taking some stuff to China and allowing you to get onto the internet, which could be illegal there, and it could be put in jail there, to sort of to do that. So I'd like to hear from both of you on sort of, so what do we do at this intermediate stage, or should we just leave the lawyers to be very happy about the intermediate stage and let it be? So what might be a plan of action?
Well, I think, and everyone should get your tomatoes ready now, because I'm about to blast on lawyers. But I think one of the big problems that we have is that you go to D.C. today, and it's like you can just stretch your arms in any direction. You can touch 4 lawyers, and there are a zillion lawyers in there trying to solve problems that intersect more and more heavily with technology. And there's no technologists in the room. And so the framework for understanding and solving these problems is wrong to begin with. And so people are kind of building solutions as best they know how, given their expertise. This just is the wrong expertise. And this is how you end up with really, I spend a lot of time up on the Hill talking with folks and just explaining really fundamentally basic notions of how the internet actually works versus what their law assumes the way that the internet actually works.
Interesting you say that, because I have the same problem with sometimes business students, that they don't learn enough about technology before they start pricing it, actually.
That's right. The difference is that your students aren't making national law, right? But I'll bet that the level of expertise is about parallel with the people that are. And that scares the bejesus out of me. It's why I created the Open Technology Initiative 3 years ago. And to this day, we're still one of the only shops that has hardcore technological know-how and can dive into the weeds and explain the particulars of how a technology works to people that are making laws without any regard for that technological reality.
Well, I do sort of agree with you to some level, but technology is also too important to be left to the techies. And having been a techie before, I know how myopic that can actually be as well. So let's hear from Ryan, and then we'll open it up to the audience to sort of see what some of their thoughts and questions might be. Ryan, any thoughts on sort of what we should do in the intermediate time?
Well, I I guess I'm a little bit puzzled by the use of the word intermediate, because it seems that that technology is moving at such a rapid pace that it seems like we're continually going to be in an intermediate time. That that whatever we think the end game is now is not going to be the end game 6 months from now or a year from now. I mean, Twitter was nothing a few years ago, and then it plays this central role in what happened in the Arab Spring, and so the fact that technology can go from non-existent to fundamental to social change in a matter of years is simply incredible. You look at there are all these statistics about how it took 75 years for like the television or the telephone to go to being common in 75% of American households, and then you have something like the internet, which reaches that same level of adoption in a decade. So I guess I don't think we're ever going to reach an intermediate stage. And as a lawyer who used to be from DC, I'll readily admit that that's it's a big problem that that the lawyer mentality is let's write a law and let's figure out how to fix it. But law changes so much more slowly than the technology is, and I don't, and lawyers tend to be trained to think, let's put every single possibility into the writing of the law, and so the narrower you write the law, the more quickly it's going to be outdated, and so I think, as Sasha was saying, the big challenge is, how do we educate people on what's going on in technologically speaking, and then I think there needs to be some emphasis on, how do you achieve your policy objectives, whether by working with the businesses or with regulation or through law in a way that won't, hinder this tremendous innovation that's going on. And, so like we were talking about copyright, copyright is one area where, technology has made it really easy for like, if you record a video on YouTube that has some music in the background, YouTube can automatically tag it and know that this is copyrighted music. And if they want, they can refuse to post the video, or they can put a little ad to have people buy the music. And yet so technology makes it really easy to determine whether there's potential infringement going on, but technology can't tell you whether it's fair use or not. I mean, how do you put that into an algorithm? And so it's really hard to address these questions through the law, particularly when the law on something like fair use is very vague and hard to, people have written books and, teach entire law school classes on what it means. So it's really challenging.
Right, thank you. So let's open it up to the audience and see what kind of questions you might have for the panel. Over there.
Hello, I'm Captain John Tuttle with the U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Legal Center and School. I work in the Future Concepts Directorate. My question to you is whether much thought has been given to where the line is drawn on crowdsourcing espionage. If I put my uniform on and go forth into another country, I'm an enemy combatant. And the international law provides me certain rights if I were to be captured. But the international law looks down most sternly on anybody doing such acts without a uniform that would constitute spying or espionage. There's no protections whatsoever for them. So if you distribute an app that says, hey, while you're out there, citizens, could you report on what you see the government doing so that we can then compile it? And then further on, we have a national policy, or at least a civil understanding, that it's our duty to undermine what we perceive as bad laws because we have a baseline understanding of humanity. Doesn't that, in some sense, crowdsource espionage? And then to bring in the risk that you had spoken of, aren't you then asking someone to do more risk than just 1% of a blog post? Aren't you actually asking them to be 1% of a spy? To get in line with the other idea that there is international, or there's national sovereignty and there's local laws. I mean, all these things, they, in and of themselves, they sound very good, but they present the United States, if they were to move forward with them, with some very interesting legal responsibilities. It makes us just akin to the patriotic hackers of Russia, it seems. And the question then is, at what point does the severity of of these actions of private parties then become an international, sort of a use of force by another government? Thank you.
I guess I'll probably add reporting to it as to how were journalists reporting from these countries, how they were looked at to begin with in the early days. And I guess maybe we can start with the one lawyer in the group to begin with.
Well, I'm not enough of an expert to offer legal advice, legal opinion on this question. But I mean, I think the question of crowdsourcing and what impact that could have on how the person is perceived under international law, I think that's a very interesting question. And I can't necessarily give an answer to that because I don't think it's been addressed. But I mean, certainly when we're asking people to report on whether a website is up or not, that does involve some measure of risk, particularly if their government doesn't approve of them doing that. That's a part of it. But what you see in countries like China, for instance, on blogs, and particularly on the microblogging services, is that in contexts where no one's specifically asking them to report, what's going on, what are they seeing, they're going out there and doing that. And some of those people get in trouble for it. Some of them don't. I mean, one of the interesting things is that if you have enough people doing it, there's sort of a protection, anonymity in the masses that happens. Particularly because the microblogging sites, go so quickly and it can just spiral out of control so quickly that it's really hard to police. And it's something that that I know that countries like China are really struggling with how they're going to handle that. It was interesting during the whole Occupy Wall Street thing in the United States, during those protests, it was reported that China was automatically censoring all tweets, if you call them that, but their equivalent, that involved the Chinese word for occupy and different cities in China. And so they were reflectively very worried that that this was going to explode in China. I mean, it didn't, but they were worried that was going to happen, and so they took this kind of heavy-handed, ham-handed approach of okay, occupy and city, we're going to block that, and it wasn't particularly effective, in targeting anything really there. So it's a So I'm, as we were saying, it's a cat and mouse game, and I think that what's going to happen with the microblogging sites in countries like China hasn't been decided yet, and that China is certainly very interested in trying to address what's going on there.
I would add, these are exactly the questions that we need to be having more in-depth conversations around. I would say that there's a meaningful difference between providing tools to a citizenry that wants to use those tools and self-selects to use those tools, and actively recruiting or requiring the use of tools by a citizenry, right? It's a meaningful difference in terms of if people self-select to be a vigilant citizen and understand the risks, which is another key issue of a lot of the tools that are out there. People don't realize they're exposing themselves to additional risk by using them. But if people self-select and desire to do that, I think expanding the tool chest that they have available is pretty much all upside. I think there's a larger question, though, in terms of, what does it mean to be aware of the risks that people are taking on? What does it mean to be actively participating in, surveillance of a government or fighting against an oppressive regime, and using these tools and potentially being connected to the U.S. or any other outside force? And international law is a hodgepodge of remarkably conflicting values and statements and rules and laws. Obviously, Geneva Conventions protect citizenry in some ways, but now we're talking about something that's sort of in between sort of militia and the citizenry, or potentially could be perceived as such. And a lot of the work that we're doing with the Internet in Suitcase, the Commotion Project, we're really pulling from kind of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 19, sort of the notion that everyone has a fundamental human right to communicate regardless of frontiers. And that's the basis. And what we find is, almost every country on earth has already signed on to that. Now, the local laws in these countries obviously often are at odds with that declaration. But again, these are exactly the kinds of conversations we need to be having, not just here stateside, but actually with our colleagues and compatriots and enemies and what have you elsewhere.
So in fact, an equivalent question can be asked when businesses use crowdsourcing for ideas and software and so on, which is, who does the sort of the onus rest on? I mean, suppose a crowdsource idea violates some law, then it's the business that uses it that becomes responsible for sort of making it out. So I guess, here the repercussion could be by the person who is sort of providing this information or this crowdsource idea. And I guess part of it really comes from the fact that a lot of interactions on the social media sites and so on could be more incidental than purposive. If you understand the risk and then purposively sort of provide some information versus you're incidentally sort of providing it in some other context and so on, which is really actually why social media is actually attractive to a lot of businesses, because you're not just conducting a purposive fiscal transaction, but you are incidentally doing something else which is of value as information to sort of a business. And that difference is actually what makes it both interesting and risky, I guess, in this case. Let's take a couple of more questions. Another question? Yes.
Lance Hockhauser. I'm with Emory International Law Review. I had a question. I guess it's mostly directed at Mr. Meinrath. You mentioned earlier about not cracking down on copyright enforcement and law enforcement a little bit. You also were talking about what might come next after SOPA and PIPA. I was wondering, along those lines, if you see, I actually had a conversation with a friend yesterday about some related aspects to this, and they mentioned a generation in Russia that really have some lack of respect for some of the laws there. Do you see that potentially becoming a problem here? And just what do you view as the next, I guess, wave of what comes after PIPA and SOPA?
Yeah, it's not potentially, I look around this room, most of you are going to be guilty of copyright infringement, right? It's open secret, piracy is rampant. Everybody knows it. A small number of people pretend that is not the case. So yeah, it might be a different set of laws, but we're definitely uninterested in certain laws here stateside as well. But I think it's more indicative of laws that don't fit within people's notions of what it means to live in a civil society. I don't know anyone that would say, if you were to allow me to pay $20 a year to just get access to any media, right? Like, almost everyone would say, you know what, that's just worth it. It's worth it for me to do that and not even worry about it. But that's not the options that we're given. And copyright's a particularly bizarre example where our laws have gotten completely out of balance with their intended purpose, right? I mean, copyright was supposed to be for a limited period of time. And we all know it's now, like 70 years plus the life of the author, or 95 years if you're a corporation. I mean, there's nothing that's produced when we're born that we will be able to legally access as fair as in the public domain before we're dead. And people look at that and they understand this is pretty egregious. It doesn't balance the purpose of copyright, which first and foremost is to forward the sciences and useful arts. To do that, we have copyright. And instead it's become an ends unto itself as opposed to a means to benefit society. So yeah, laws like that and rules that continually don't meet the needs of participants in a society, yeah, I think there's always been a place for civil disobedience. It's part of the very fabric of the history of the United States. And I think there's a number of laws that have clearly gotten out of whack with our notions of what it means to live in a civil society. Now, you can't say this sort of thing in D.C., right? You can't look over, a group of representatives and say, like, you guys are all pirates. I know it. You know it. Like, let's get beyond this. Everyone instead says, like, no, piracy is bad. We would never, ever, ever do that. No one I know would ever, ever do that. And within that kind of context, it's very difficult to have honest discussions around, well, how do we solve this problem? How do we improve the laws or the regulations to better address what we meant when we were passing these things in the first place? And it's Russia, it's the United States, it's all around the globe.
Any question?
My question is directed at Mr. Budish. I was wondering, you spoke about internet activism versus traditional activism, and I was specifically wondering how internet activism accounts for the fact that millions of people don't have access to the internet, and I guess in that same vein, whether you see internet activism as working with traditional activism or displacing traditional activism.
Good question. So I guess to address the first question, obviously, certainly online activism doesn't work if you don't have access to the internet, clearly. But I think it's still worth thinking about because the internet, as I said a few minutes ago, its adoption has just been tremendous around the world, and that's going to continue. And there are parts of the world that don't have access right now, but in 10 and 20 years they will, and they'll be dealing with these same issues. And so so yeah, absolutely. It's as to quote the Twitter hashtag first world problems. It's a first world problem, maybe a second world problem, but it is limited. And then with your second question, I don't believe that online activism is going to replace traditional activism. And I was more just trying to draw the distinction that they have different advantages and disadvantages, and they will be deployed sometimes, perhaps all the time going forward in concert. The Arab Spring again, and you could talk about Occupy Wall Street, for instance. Those were very much, in-person traditional forms of activism, but And if you talk to people who are involved with Arab Spring, they will vehemently assert that it was not, as Sasha was saying, a Twitter revolution. It was not a Facebook revolution. This was a real political movement. And they believe that if you say that it's a Twitter revolution, that it somehow, that it demeans what they accomplished, and maybe it does. And so, but there's no denying the role that Twitter played in helping to facilitate it, that Facebook played. And so, I think that the forms of technology, or the technology in the internet is going to play a larger and larger role, particularly when as mobile internet becomes much more widespread all over the world. That when you're out in a protest or when you're walking on the street, you'll be able to get information in the moment on your smartphone, your iPhone, whatever is around. So it's not going to replace, one's not going to replace the other, but they're going to be inseparable, I think.
But this is actually what we sometimes call the problem of endogeneity in econometrics, which is how do you separate sort of the impact on the influence, meaning that there are certain kind of people who have access to this technology who are part of the revolution. So is it really their views alone that is being reflected in whatever that is actually happening, rather than the general mass which should have participated in an average revolution? I mean, maybe like the French Revolution, where you didn't necessarily need to be literate or any such requirement. And so, and there is always this sort of discussion as to whether one is viewing merely the representation of the technologically sophisticated and elitist views, or is it more groundswell? Do you have any thoughts on that, Sasha?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the thinking in this area really I would call it sort of the Wired magazine thinking, right? The techno-determinism that the solutions are technological, the technologies will set us free, that, there's always upsides and what have you. Time and time again, we see that the actual roles of these technologies, and I'm speaking as, technologist. I like technology. I just don't view it as the center around which things happen or don't happen, any more than, I'd call the American Revolution, the pamphleteer revolution or what have you. I think, yes, pamphlets were used. They were helpful. The newspaper, the rise of the newspaper in America, this is what Alexis de Tocqueville's talking about when he's talking about democracy in America and everyone's swapping information, and that's good. It's healthy for democracy. But it's not the pinion around which American democracy rotates. It's not the end-all and be-all any more than any of these other technologies are, right? And it doesn't matter if you're organizing here stateside amongst, the most elitist of the elite. The technology is a useful tool, but it's the means to a different end. And the ends often are quite offline. They're based on trustable networks that are not captured in the Facebooks and what have you, or not wholly captured by any means in that. And it's easy to forget that. It's especially easy to forget that when you are thousands of miles away, only viewing what's happening mediated through the Facebooks and the Twitter hashtags and the lazy reporting that often happens around these kinds of events. But again, this is, to me at least, this is a phenomenon that seems intractable, right? It was bizarre to me a few months ago, I guess it was the end of last year, to open up Wired magazine and see that in their jargon watch was Internet in a Suitcase, my project. And it's particularly interesting to me because there is no internet in a suitcase. I was telling people last night, the internet in a suitcase was born because when the New York Times wanted to take a picture of our work, we're doing software development. So there's no real awesome do-jobby that you can take a picture of and has blinky lights and lots of coolness factor to it. And so we told them, like, well, we can just take a bunch of equipment and stick it into like a briefcase or something like that. And they're like, great, we're going to send a photographer, we're going to take a picture of this. And so we literally went around the office and pulled random equipment from throughout the office, stuck it into this Pelican case, and they took a photograph of it and called it the internet in a suitcase. But there is no suitcase. It's a visual aid gone completely out of control that's now a meme that people are looking for and expecting. Like the next generation of activists aren't going to be lugging giant Pelican cases across borders. They're going to be having a USB drive or something on their phone or a CD-ROM or any one of a number of different vectors for moving software to different devices. So it was like an accidental agitprop that, you know, like we never intended. But you can see how people are looking to the technology. They want something sexy. They want something photographable. They want something that's like tangible that they can see, like, this is going to liberate us.
Absolutely. We'll take one more question to end on time.
Hi, my name's Hannah Anderson. I'm a student here. And my question is, what is the role of anonymity or pseudonymity on the internet, especially as Facebook, for example, makes a strong push for what they call integrity, but they mean you're using your real name and your real address. And to me, especially with the risk that's been mentioned, how do we, as governments and as corporations, deal with a desire for anonymity and desires against allowing anonymity?
Well, let me take a first cut at that. You know, one of the first cartoons that appeared was Nobody Knows If You're a Dog on the Internet, right? I mean, I guess you all remember that cartoon where a dog is in front of the computer and nobody knows, you know, sort of who you are. The truth of the matter is, I actually think there is really no anonymity on the internet. I mean, in the sense that while we can use various handles and so on and so forth, just even based on what research I do, actually it is statistically possible to almost identify sometimes with 99% accuracy sort of who somebody is. And this was actually the basic problem that came about when DoubleClick, you know, which is this large advertisement firm now owned by Google, when they bought something called Abacus, which was basically a direct marketing firm. And so these direct marketing firms know your name, you know, your address. That's how you get all these junk mail, right? And so when DoubleClick actually bought this firm, they had a way to sort of statistically start matching people based on, you know, there is like tons of criteria and you can do some kind of Bayesian matching and so on. And actually they were able to figure out to a very large extent as to who these people are. And so some corporations are capable of doing that, and consumers might think, or people might think, they are sort of, you know, anonymous. So that's sort of the first view of it, but I think from, I guess, the overall perspective of your question, I mean, is there really true anonymity? I mean, what does it mean to be anonymous or pseudo-anonymous, and Facebook requiring you have to have a particular name? I don't know if you remember, like, actually Salman Rushdie recently when he was in India, he tried to get a Facebook page or a Twitter hashtag or something that was with his name, and they didn't really believe it was him, and there was, you know, there was a lot of sort of issues with that. So in other words, can corporations, should they actually determine these things? So there are obviously a lot of these questions, and it'll be interesting to hear our panel's take on it.
Well, from with what we do at Herdict, anonymity is certainly very important. You know, obviously we want people to be comfortable to go and report sites, and we currently don't ask people to log in, and you know, we don't, so they're not reporting as, you know, under their name. But, you know, anonymity is often placed in the balance with trustworthiness. You know, you sort of see that kind of struggle on something like eBay. You know, how do you build a trustworthiness regime if you don't necessarily know who specifically that person is on the other end of the transaction? So, and to some extent, you know, we have that same problem on Herdict, in that if someone files a report, you know, how do you know that that report is accurate? if you don't have any way of tracking their history on the site. And I mean, luckily, one of the benefits of crowdsourcing is that if you happen to have a non-cynical view of the world, you can believe or hope that if you're getting enough data coming into the system, that the good people, the honest people, will outweigh the people who are trying to file some false reports, and so then you don't really need to worry as much about anonymity versus trustworthiness. But it is certainly a problem that people think about and that we think about at Herdic.
Non-cynical people of the world, Sasha?
Yeah, so I'm going to fundamentally agree with what you said, Ram, before I completely categorically disagree with certain segments of it. But that, I mean, for the vast majority of you, there's no meaningful anonymity or privacy when you're online. It's not that you can't get there, right? For people like me, when I choose to be anonymous or private, it's going to be very difficult to track me. But again, you're talking about a whole different skill set. And part of the problem is that for the technically savvy, finding anonymity, ensuring their privacy is not even that difficult a lift anymore. On the other hand, what the Facebooks and Googles and most law enforcement mechanisms are set to do isn't to actually find those constituencies. It's meant to surveil the vast majority of all of you. And you can see this very explicitly in the number of hackers that are actually caught. It makes big stories. It often makes national news, when they catch a small cadre of hackers. Now, I'm not a genius here, but I know that, if they're spending a couple of minutes of national news on a single hacker, they're really not catching a whole lot of them. And I would argue that they're probably catching far less than 1% of them. And that's with all of the abilities and law enforcement resources that we have to bring to bear on that problem. And so, yes, there's anonymity and privacy galore if you have the expertise. In the interim, we don't have the kind of protections, the privacy and anonymity protections for the vast majority of the populace that should be in place. Right? Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, et cetera, really don't mean all that much if you don't also have the privacy and anonymity that should be concomitant with them. And, again, this comes down to the normative assumptions of what it means to live in a democracy today and what it means to have, in essence, a complete no man's land or a wild west when it comes to what the Facebooks and Googles and et cetera can do. There's no laws saying what they're doing is illegal. Likewise, there's no laws protecting you from whatever the hell it is they decide they want to do. And so what we come down to is this constant cat and mouse game where people get upset when something happens, and so they bring it back a little bit, and then the next year they try it again, and they see, are people going to get upset with us this time? And it's a losing battle over time. We will always lose that battle. We can't, it's an attrition of our energies that they are paid to do because there's billions of dollars that they will earn once they completely decimate any privacy that you might have thought you had. And this is, into the space, this is the role that good legislation should play in a civil society, to protect us from that kind of corporate malfeasance.
Well, on that good note, we shall end. It's right about 11:15, and never stand between an audience and its lunch. Thank the panelists very much. Thank you.
Thank you.